Hello there, crafter. Today I am going to show you how we take this crochet panel and we add a fabric back to it to make a removable pillowcase cover. Just as a heads up, I am not the best with a sewing machine. We are going to use a sewing machine for a little bit of hemming, but when it comes down to actually attaching the back to this crochet piece, I'm going to be sewing by hand. You are more than welcome to try using the sewing machine. I just had a lot of trouble with it because I already struggle with sewing machines and the crochet fabric has stretch to it, whereas the just normal fabric that you buy from the craft store does not. So basically I end up with some really wonky test mini pillows that I was making. But it's really not too bad hand sewing these. They go a lot faster than you would think, and they're super cute when done. So this is the one that I'm going to be showing in this tutorial today. Here's one that I already have assembled. So it's a little wonky looking right now, but once you have a pillow in it, it fills it out. And then on the back, basically, you have these two flaps. So this is all sewn around the edge. You've got this flap, you can open it up and put your pillow inside of there. We'll get some shots of that. And you have a nice removable festive pillowcase cover, or of course you can use this for any season. So first thing you will need, obviously, is you will need to crochet yourself whatever your cover wants to look like. I went with this cute Christmas tree graph and this green buffalo plaid. I'm basing my panel size off of pillows I already have because I'm making this pillow cover for a specific pillow. So the pillow that I'm making a cover for is 16 inches by 16 inches. So when I made my square, I made my graph and then I added some edging, and if we measure it here, it's right about at 16 there, and right about at 16 there. If anything, you may want it a little bit smaller just because the crochet will still have some stretch, but I like to do it right at the size of the pillow itself. So that's the first thing we need. The next thing we will need is some fabric to make those back panels. I went to the wonderful Hobby Lobby and got this just plain black fabric. I actually don't really know what exactly fabric this is. I will look on the website and see if I can figure out which specifically it was. But what's really awesome is if you get a cut of fabric, you can use the 40% off coupon on that. So this fabric was only $4.99 to start with. I got 2 2/3 yards and I used my 40% off. So it only came to about 13 bucks. Not too bad. I'm making a ton of these pillows. So anywhere from like 8 to a dozen. So that was pretty good price, it felt like. With our fabric, we will need to cut out 2 panels for the back. You may not be doing a pillow that is 16 by 16, so I'm gonna walk you through my process of how I came up with the sizes that I cut out my panels. This is basic scratch work I was doing here. 16 inches by 16 inches is my finished pillow size. So I want to have about 4 inches of overlap between the panels. So I went ahead and took my height here because I want them to overlap, you know, running this way versus overlapping vertically. So I took my height and I added how many inches of overlap I wanted. So I took my 16, which is how tall the pillow is, added 4 inches, that's 20 inches, and that's going to include the overlap. I took that number and divided it by 2, so you get 10, and this is how tall I want each of my panels to be. So that way I have the overlap. So basically, when it's all said and done, I'm going to have a panel that ends up being 10 inches by 16 inches and a second panel that's 10 inches by 16 inches. However, I'm going to be doing some hemming on them. So we need to include a little bit more fabric to hem them. So this is my height. To my height, because that's how I'm having a vertical overlap, I added 1 3/4 inches. That 1 3/4 inches is really arbitrary. Basically, that gives me enough space to double fold over the top, I'll explain that, and hem it, and then also fold the bottom up 1 time. So that's why I went with 1 3/4 inches. Again, that was a little bit arbitrary. So I got 11 3/4 inches for that. For my width, I only need to fold in the sides just 1 time. Again, I'll explain that. So I added 1 1/4 inches, and that gave me my new measurements. Therefore, when I actually cut out my pieces of fabric, for this size pillow, I cut out an 11 3/4 inch by 17 1/4 inch piece of fabric. Hopefully that explanation makes sense, and no matter what size your pillow is, you are able to work through and come up with what measurements you need to cut your fabric out. So I have 2 rectangles of fabric here. I went ahead and cut them out in a big batch. As I mentioned, sewing is not my forte, so I don't have any like great tips or anything for cutting out your fabric. Really what I did was I first ironed my whole big piece, and then I used this big yardstick and a ruler to make my measurements, and I had a piece of paper that has a right corner to make sure my edges were right corners, and I got a nice rectangular piece instead of it being like shifted weird. So I have 2 of these panels. And the first thing we want to do with our panels is to prepare them for sewing them onto the crochet cover. Here is how we are going to prepare our panels. So this is the top where I folded it over twice to create this hem. This is the right side, meaning the side you will see, and you can see my nice, really like wonky sewing because I'm not good with the sewing machine. And on my other 3 edges, I folded them in and ironed them in. This is preparing it to be sewn onto our pillow cover. So let's actually do this process with one of our panels for the Christmas tree pillow. As I mentioned, you want to iron your pieces because it just makes everything go together so much better. So I've had my iron heating up, and I'm apparently gonna iron a crease into it because that's just how my life goes. Get as many of these wrinkles out as I can. Now that my panel is nice and smooth, the first thing I want to do is I want to fold over one of the edges twice and iron it, and then we're gonna run it through the sewing machine. So to do this, like I said, my added measurements were really arbitrary. So I'm going to fold this edge over twice, and sorry, my camera doesn't like to focus on the black. So I'm gonna fold it over once, and then fold that edge over a second time, and I'm going to iron that down. You don't want to fold over too much or else your panel might end up being too short, but as long as you're not folding over more than like an inch total, you should be good. I'll just kind of mention the reason I'm being arbitrary was because when we were buying our fabric and measuring like how much fabric we needed to buy, I just added that arbitrary 1 3/4 and 1 1/4. I know the standard is to do a 5/8 inch, but as I mentioned, I am not skilled at all with sewing. For the purposes of this project, this is going to work fine as long as we don't sew over too much. Basically, the way we know whether or not we've sewn over too much is I know that from my measurements earlier, from my calculations earlier, from this edge to this edge, once this is folded over, it needs to be 10 inches. So I'm at 11 inches right here, so I've got a full inch that I have to fold over to bring it to that 10 inches, so I know I'm good. If you have less than 10 inches or you are exactly at 10 inches and don't have enough to fold over, you'll want to make this folded hem a little bit narrower. All right, but we've got this folded and ironed flat, and now we're going to run it through the sewing machine. So I have my sewing machine threaded up, and I'm going to run this through here. I'm probably just gonna speed this part up because I'm probably about to embarrass myself by trying to sew this on camera. If you don't feel comfortable with the sewing machine, please don't go, oh, well, Amanda says that I can just use a sewing machine. Do what you're comfortable with. If you need to hand stitch it, that's totally okay. And as always, put safety first. And I ran out of thread. Let me change my thread color. Sewing the hem, part 2. Ta-da! And by the way, I'm using blue thread because I ran out of black thread. So this is our hem. This is what I'm calling the wrong side, meaning it'll be on the inside of the pillow. And the smoother, flatter side is the right side or the outside of the pillow. So we're gonna put this right side face down on our ironing board. So we have the wrong side facing us. What we want to do next is we need to fold in and iron the rest of our edges to create the corners. And basically we're sizing it down to be the size of the actual pillow. So meaning when we get done with this, once we fold this bottom up and fold the sides in, it will be 16 inches by 10 inches because that's what we calculated we want each panel to be. So for this part, here's how I do this. Again, this is kind of a forgiving project. This probably isn't the right way, to sew. There's probably better ways. This is just the way that I found works for me. So I need this to be 10 inches when it's all said and done. So I'm lining up my ruler on the one end there. And then here at the 10-inch mark, I'm making a mark with my chalk. And I'm gonna do a couple of those down the length of my fabric. And what I'm going to do now, if you can see those lines, is I'm going to fold it over on those lines. Again, this isn't going to be exact, and the nice thing is with this piece, it just means your panels will overlap a little bit more or a little bit less, so it's very forgiving. I'm gonna fold it over that much, and this time, like I said, I made this fold really short, so that's why this one's so big, because I had that arbitrary 1 3/4 inch, but I'm gonna fold it over and then iron this crease. So that way when I go to sew, it will stay folded over. So when it's all said and done, we should now have 10 inches all the way along, and it is roughly 10 inches all the way along, so that's good. Next thing we need to do is fold in the sides. I need this to be a total of 16 inches across. So right now it's about like 17.25 as we cut it. So the way I do this is I've got about 1.25 inches I need to take in. So on this side, I'm gonna fold in an arbitrary amount. Basically this arbitrary amount is I'm just folding in a little bit and just making sure I'm not folding in more than 1 inch. And I'm going to iron this down. Obviously be careful with your iron, don't burn yourself, because that's not fun. And I'm leaking water here, that's awesome. So I've got this side folded in, and notice that I'm folding everything on top. So what I need to do is once I fold this side in, I need the distance from this edge to the folded edge to be 16 inches, which is the width of my pillow. So basically we're gonna do this the same way we did this bottom one here. I'm gonna get out my yardstick here. With my fabric chalk, I'm going to mark at the 16 inches so I know how much I need to fold over. Got my marks there, we will spin this around and I will fold my fabric in that amount and then iron it. So now I have this panel that is hemmed on the one side and folded and ironed in on the 3 others. I'm gonna repeat this process with my second panel, and then it will be time to sew our panels onto our crochet piece. All right, so this next step is to get the first panel sewn on here. With my pillows, I made it so that way this top one goes over the bottom one. If you want, you can of course choose whether the bottom one to go over the top one or sideways, if just depending on how you're doing your flap, but this is how I'm going to do mine. So if I want my top panel over my bottom one, I need to put the bottom one on first. When we assemble this one here says Joy. We want all the right sides facing inward because then we will inside out our pillowcase. And when we inside out it, that's what will cause the second one we put on to be on the top on the outside. So we're going to take our Christmas tree pillow and our first fabric panel and get it to this stage of the process. We want to start with our crochet panel facing right side up. So this is the side I want to be on the outside because this side is where I have all my tails pulled through. So whatever you want to be the outside, you want facing towards you because we are going to inside out this. Now one thing I really quick will mention is you might notice my crochet piece is a little bit ripply, and that's just because of tension and different things like that. If you want, I'm not going to do this, but if you want, you can, on the wrong side of your work, flip it over and on a really low setting, iron your crochet piece. And I would just go press, 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 press really quickly because you don't want to melt or ruin the fibers. If you do want to try ironing it, please don't try it immediately on your big, nice crochet graph. I would first, using the same yarn, make a little test square and try ironing it and see if you like those results before you try it on your big crochet piece. However, I found that once I actually put the pillow in here, the fluffiness of the pillow fills in and smooths out any little ripples and things like that, so I'm not going to be ironing my piece. So I've got my panel here ready, facing up towards me, the right side. And then I have this fabric piece. I'm going to align this so that way my corners obviously line up with the corners of my crochet piece. And I want the hemmed edge up here along the top because that's the nice edge that we will see. And very important, I want this turned so that way all my folded sides are facing up. So see how this flap folds on top, it doesn't fold under. If you have your panel so that way the pieces are folded under, when we inside out it, it's gonna look really sloppy. So we want the messy looking side facing us. What I like to do, because even with hand sewing, it's easy to end up with the wrong tension where you accidentally stretch out your crochet piece and then it makes your cloth all bunchy. What I would suggest is getting out some safety pins and adding them to your project. So I'm going to start with the corners and go right through the corner of my fabric. Let's zoom this in a little bit so you can see this. Go through the corner of my fabric with the safety pin and the corner of my crochet fabric. And that will get it held in place somewhat. Remember that if your safety pin, it's gonna have a little bit of play in it still, but we're just gonna get roughly lined up as a guide. Once I get the first corner safety pin down, I'll come to this next corner, making sure that I've got, you know, my ironed seams and folds all laying flat the way I want it to. Go through the fabric, go through the corner of the crochet, and pin that down. Keeping everything laying nice, smooth, and flat, I'm also going to pin up here at the top corner of my fabric panel where it lines up with the crochet at the edge. And same on the opposite side. Now, this is important when you line it up on the opposite side. If you just like look at it and go, oh, this looks flat, I'll pin it down, you may actually end up with your back panels really crooked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow along here and make sure that the top hits at the same row on the opposite side. So I'm gonna follow this row along here, keeping my panel lined up. Unfortunately, just laying flat, it lines up pretty good, but you want to make sure before you pin it all down and start sewing it on there that it actually is lined up. So you'll end up with a nicer finished pillow cover. So now I'm going to get some thread and start sewing around here. I am going to first add a couple more safety pins. So that way when I'm working down this side, I don't accidentally, you know, bunch up a bunch of my crochet fabric for the first half and then make it loose and weird for the second half. So what I like to do, get another safety pin ready. I like to grab where the safety pins are and just give everything a stretch. Make sure that when you stretch this, you're not sliding your safety pins. So hold your safety pin spots down. Just give everything kind of a nice little stretch and find the middle and go through the middle while everything's all stretched out and even. And that will keep you really on track as you go. And you of course can do more. You could split that in half if you want. I think this is good enough for this one. And you can pin as you go, or you can pin it all in place like I'm doing here. Once we have it pinned in place, I'm going to get a needle. I'm going to string my thread onto it. And since I'm sewing by hand, I'm going to double up the length of my thread here. I've cut a nice long piece. It's probably about 2 feet long, doubled up. I'm gonna come to my end where I have my 2 ends here. I'm gonna tie a couple of overhand knots. And you don't wanna make your pieces of thread too long or else then they're more likely to get tangled while you are sewing around. So I wouldn't go beyond, you know, 2, maybe 3 feet at a time. And you will need to get a couple different pieces of thread as you work around. So I'm gonna hold here with the end of the knot and slide it between my fingers so that way it's all smoothed out. And I have my needle at the end. Zooming it again. So I'm going to start here at this corner of the fabric. And I'll try as best I can not to cast shadows. Let me actually get another light here. All right, I've got my phone light shining on it. Hopefully we can get this to be seen really well here. So I'm going to start by going through my fabric, going through the crochet piece and the fabric piece. The way through. And this is my end here with the knot on it. I'm going to go between that loop there with my needle, and I'll zoom this in hopefully when I'm editing, and pull it on through just to kind of secure it on there well. And then I'm gonna do a down, up kind of stitch. It probably has a name, but I don't actually know the name of that, so I'm going to come here and go down through my fabric and the crochet piece. If you don't want this to get tangled, this big loopy end here, I like to just kind of hold a finger in it as it slides down, and then at the end I just let it go and let it go through, and that keeps knots and things from forming. Then this time I'm gonna come up, so I'm gonna go through the crochet fabric piece first, and then through the actual fabric, pull it up. Make sure that you don't accidentally catch it on your safety pin and that you don't leave extra slack in it from the safety pin. But really at this point it's just straight up sewing. We're going down through the fabric and into the crochet. And then up through the crochet and up into the fabric. And just try to work really tightly and evenly and securely along the edge. And yes, this is probably the most tedious part and it takes time. But once you get done with this, we will add our next panel and then you will be just about done with your project. So I have finished crocheting on the first panel here. You may notice it might get a little bit puckery on the fabric, and that's really okay. You know, it's just because of the stretchiness of the crochet. It's kind of elasticy pulling the fabric in, but once you get a pillow in there, it all stretches and evens out. I have my next panel here that I have hemmed this side here. I've ironed in these sides and folded them this way, so that way this square here is 16, which is the width of my piece, and then it's 10 inches, so that way I get about 4 inches of overlap. Again, I'm gonna keep, you know, my wrong side up, which is the side with these folds facing upwards. I've got this piece here. I'm gonna keep this. This is the front of the pillowcase here in the tree, and I'm going to just place this on here, pin the corners. I'll pin along the side. As you can see there, we've got some overlap there. And then I will sew it up with my needle and thread, just like I did the first piece. I'll trim my pieces of thread, and then we will have a finished pillowcase. So again, once I pin the one side, when I go to pin this other side, I want to look at where I am on my rows of crochet. So I'll need to kind of flip this over to look at it, but I want to make sure that I'm coming down the same number of rows on my crochet project so I'm not accidentally making it really crooked. So I'm going to adjust that, pin that corner down, sew around the edge, and then I'll show you what we've got. My pillow is now fully assembled. I sewed around the second panel and I cut my threads off, took out my safety pins. Here's a closer look at the stitching that I did all the way around. So as you can see, it's pretty tight there. But now that we've got it assembled, it is time to inside out it. So we've got a nice bit of overlap here. Push out the corners. If you can't get the corners pushed out all the way, you can use something like a ruler or an unsharpened pencil to really inside out the corners. So here's a look at the back. We've got a nice good bit of overlap here. We'll be able to fit our pillow into it. And then if we flip it over, this is how it looks from the front. So I'll go ahead and put this on a pillow so you can see how it really looks. Here's the finished look. I put it over one of those pillows like that bear pillow there. And here's a look from the back. I basically just slid it in to the panels, and you can kind of get a look that it fills out the pillowcase really nicely, and that warpiness doesn't really show up here. I'll give you some other looks of these pillows, and also there's a couple others that I made as well, and I'll include links to the patterns or the pattern inspirations for all these pillows down in the description below. But don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel if you aren't already one of my regular crafters, and make sure you come back for more awesome crafting content. See you on my next video, and happy crafting!